The flag was still burning when Sergeant First Class Raymond Earl Kowalski stepped off his front porch. He didn't run, he didn't yell, he didn't reach for his phone. He just stood there on the damp morning grass of Clover Hill Lane, in the gray pre-dawn light of a Thursday in late September, watching the last of the orange flames curl around the grommets of his 48-star commemorative American flag, the one his late wife Patricia had given him on the 25th anniversary of his retirement from the United States Army, and he breathed in through his nose slowly, the way a combat medic learns to breathe when there's nothing left to do but think clearly. The smell of burning nylon filled the quiet street. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The sprinklers on the Hendersons' lawn clicked on automatically, filling the silence with that familiar suburban rhythm. Raymond didn't move for a long moment. Then he walked back inside, poured himself a second cup of coffee, sat down at his kitchen table, and opened his notebook to a fresh page. He uncapped his pen. He wrote the date, the time, the temperature, and a single sentence. He made his last mistake this morning. Let me tell you about Clover Hill Lane. It sits in the heart of Millbrook Crossing, a quiet residential neighborhood on the eastern edge of Cedar Falls, Iowa, a town of about 40,000 people nestled along the Cedar River, where the summers smell like freshly cut hay and the winters come in cold and honest without apology. This was the summer of 2019. The hydrangeas were still blooming along the fence lines. Kids rode their bikes to the community pool 2 streets over. Old Carl Brinkman still walked his basset hound, Biscuit, every morning at 6:30, and every morning Biscuit stopped at the same fire hydrant on the corner of Clover Hill and Maple Drive, which Carl had long since accepted as simply the price of dog ownership. It was the kind of street where people waved at each other from their driveways, without necessarily knowing each other's last names, where somebody always plowed the sidewalk for the elderly widow at number 14 without being asked, where the 4th of July block party had happened every single year since 1987, with the same folding tables and the same potato salad recipe, and the same slightly out-of-tune rendition of God Bless America, played on Carl Brinkman's portable speaker. It was, in every sense of the word, a good street. And for 19 years, the house at 224 Clover Hill Lane had been the quiet anchor of it all. Sergeant First Class Raymond Earl Kowalski, United States Army, retired. Born in 1952 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the second son of a steelworker and a schoolteacher. He enlisted at 18 in the summer of 1970 at the height of Vietnam. He served 2 tours with the 1st Cavalry Division, earning the Bronze Star with valor for pulling 2 wounded men from a burning APC outside QU Letter 1EA3 and GTR Letter 1ECB province in April of 1972. He re-enlisted and re-enlisted again. He became a senior NCO, then a military intelligence analyst, then an instructor at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where he spent a decade teaching young soldiers how to collect information, identify patterns, build documented cases, and present evidence in ways that held up under pressure. He served 26 years total. Army, 1970 to 1996. He deployed to Vietnam twice, participated in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, and spent time in Germany, South Korea, and Honduras. He earned the Bronze Star, the Army Commendation Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, the Combat Infantryman Badge, and a long list of service ribbons that told the story of a man who had answered the call every single time it came. He retired at 54 years old, moved to Cedar Falls because Patricia had always loved Iowa, and spent the next 19 years becoming exactly the kind of neighbor that every street deserves but rarely gets. He was the man who showed up with a casserole when Linda Hernandez's mother passed. The man who helped the Nakamura twins with their Eagle Scout project. The man who, every Memorial Day morning without fail, walked to the end of his driveway and raised his flag, that 48-star commemorative flag Patricia had given him, before the rest of the neighborhood was even awake. He was 71 years old in the summer of 2019. He walked with a slight limp from a knee replacement 2 years prior. He had mild PTSD that showed up mostly in the form of insomnia, which is why he was always the first one on the block to see the sunrise. He kept a vegetable garden in the backyard and built birdhouses in his garage workshop, detailed, beautiful things that he gave away to anyone who admired them. He had 3 grandchildren in Des Moines who called him Grandpa Ray. Patricia had passed in 2014 from ovarian cancer. Her memorial rose bush, a deep red climbing variety she'd planted herself along the south fence, still bloomed every June without fail. Raymond Kowalski was not a man who made enemies. Until one moved in next door. The moving truck arrived on a Wednesday in mid-July of 2019. Not one truck, two. And behind them, a pearl-white 2021 Cadillac Escalade with 22-inch chrome rims, tinted windows, and a temporary paper plate from a dealership in Chicago. It parked across two driveways, Raymond's and the Garcias, at 222, without a second thought. His name was Brandon Kyle Ashworth III. 29 years old, the only son of Brandon Kyle Ashworth II, who had made a considerable fortune in commercial real estate development throughout the greater Chicago metro area and had, over the course of several years, effectively handed that fortune to his son in installments, apparently mistaking money for parenting. Brandon III, as he was known among his former Chicago social circle, which was not an affectionate nickname, had most recently been the co-founder of something called Ashworth Nexus Solutions, a digital lifestyle optimization platform that had received $4.2 million in seed funding before dissolving 18 months later for reasons that his LinkedIn profile described as market pivoting, and that several former employees described in Glassdoor reviews as something considerably less flattering. He'd moved to Cedar Falls because the money his father had given him went 3 times as far in Iowa as it did in Chicago, and because Cedar Falls did not yet know who he was. The first red flag came before the movers had even finished unloading. Raymond had walked over, introduced himself, extended his hand. It was a warm Iowa afternoon, and Raymond had brought 2 cold bottles of water, one for the neighbor, one as a gesture of goodwill. Brandon looked at Raymond's hand the way a man looks at something he's just scraped off his shoe. "Yeah," he said, accepting one of the waters without eye contact, already looking at his phone. "The old guy with the flag, I saw it when we drove up." He paused, took a sip, and said casually, like it was nothing, "You might want to take that down, actually. Kind of an eyesore." Raymond looked at him for a moment. "Welcome to Clover Hill Lane," he said quietly, and walked back home. Now, at this point in the story, some of you might be thinking, okay, rude, but it's just a first impression. Maybe he was stressed. Maybe moving day was a lot. Maybe he'd come around. You've never met a man like Brandon Kyle Ashworth III. The music started at 11:45 on a Friday night. A deep, thumping bass line that Raymond could feel in the floor of his bedroom. He lay in bed for a while, the way a patient man does, giving it time to stop on its own. It didn't. At 12:30 in the morning he got up, put on his slippers and his old army sweatshirt, and walked next door. He knocked 3 measured knocks. Brandon answered in 60 seconds, drink in one hand, phone in the other, looking like he'd forgotten the rest of the world existed outside his living room. "Ray," he said. He'd taken to calling him Ray, which Raymond had never invited. "It's barely past midnight." "It's 12:30, Raymond said, "and I was in bed." "The whole street goes to bed this early." Brandon grinned like this was somehow a punchline. Raymond kept his voice level. "I'm not here about the whole street. I'm here about me, and I'm asking you, neighbor to neighbor, to please turn it down." Brandon looked at him for a moment. Then he said, and this is the line, folks, this is the one that tells you everything you need to know about this young man, he said. "Listen, old man, this isn't your little army base. I can do what I want in my own house." He closed the door. Not slammed, closed, like Raymond wasn't even worth the drama of a slam. Raymond stood on the porch for a moment. The bass continued. A light came on in the Garcia's window across the street. He walked back home, went to his kitchen table, opened his notebook. Wrote the time, wrote what was said, word for word. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever tried to be reasonable with someone who has no interest in being reasonable? Someone who takes your patience as evidence that they've already won? Drop a comment below and tell me about it, because what Raymond did next, most people don't have the discipline to do it. He didn't call the police that night. He didn't knock on Brandon's door again. He went to his garage, took down one of his old notebooks from his military intelligence days, the kind with the reinforced cover and the waterproof pages, and he started what he would later refer to simply as the log. Date, time, duration, decibel estimate, weather conditions, names of witnesses. And right there on page 1, taped to the inside cover, was a small laminated card with the Cedar Falls Municipal Code citations for noise ordinance violations, property code regulations, and the exact process for filing a formal complaint with the Lynn County District Court. 26 years in military intelligence, the man knew how to build a case. And he was only just beginning. What followed over the next 8 weeks was, by any reasonable measure, a systematic campaign of harassment, though Brandon almost certainly didn't think of it that way. To him, it was just living, just doing what he wanted. The rest of the street was an inconvenience, and Raymond Kowalski was a particular one. 3 days after the midnight music incident, Raymond came out to find his mailbox, a solid iron post-mount box he'd installed himself in 2003, leaning at a 30-degree angle, the post clearly struck by something at the base. Brandon's Escalade had a faint new scrape along the front passenger side bumper. Raymond photographed both, wrote it down. A week later, 2 bags of trash appeared on Raymond's side of the property line, not at the curb, not in a can, just sitting there in the grass at 7 in the morning, already leaking something dark and terrible smelling. Raymond photographed them, called the city for a code violation, wrote it down. The parking escalated next. Brandon began leaving the Escalade blocking Raymond's driveway for hours at a time, sometimes overnight. Raymond photographed timestamps, called for non-emergency police escorts twice. Both times the responding officer, a young patrolman named Officer Diaz, came out, knocked on Brandon's door, and watched Brandon move the car with a performance of exaggerated inconvenience that managed to be both rude to the officer and dismissive of Raymond simultaneously. Officer Diaz, for his part, was professional. He was also starting to recognize Raymond's address in the dispatch queue. Then came the HOA complaint. Cedar Falls doesn't have a formal HOA for the Millbrook Crossing neighborhood. It's not that kind of subdivision, but it does have a neighborhood property standards board that handles aesthetic complaints. In August of 2019, Raymond received a formal letter informing him that an anonymous neighbor had reported his garage workshop as a possible illegal commercial operation, and his vegetable garden as a municipal code violation for exceeding allowable square footage. Neither complaint had any legal merit. Raymond knew this, but it took 3 weeks, 2 formal response letters, and 1 in-person meeting with the city's code enforcement office to put both matters to rest. He wrote it all down. But here's what Brandon didn't know, here's what nobody on Clover Hill Lane knew at the time. While he was filing petty complaints and blocking driveways, Raymond Kowalski had made 3 phone calls. One to his old friend Dolores Whitaker, now a senior paralegal at the largest civil litigation firm in Cedar Rapids. One to his neighbor Carl Brinkman's son-in-law, who happened to work in the county assessor's office. And one to a man named Master Sergeant, retired Terrence Ockhaffer, his intelligence instructor from Fort Huachuca, who now worked as a contract investigator for the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. He wasn't filing complaints yet. He was collecting. There's something you should understand about a man trained in military intelligence. He doesn't react, he observes, he waits. He lets the other side show their hand completely before he ever reveals his own. Brandon Ashworth was playing checkers. Raymond Kowalski was playing a game Brandon didn't even know how to board. And then, in the 3rd week of September, Brandon Ashworth stopped playing small. It happened on a Tuesday morning, September 24, 2019. It was cool, 51 degrees, with a low gray sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to rain. Raymond had been up since 5 as usual. He'd had his coffee, done his stretches, and gone out to check on Patricia's rose bush, which was in its final bloom of the season, a cluster of deep red flowers that still made him stop and look every single morning, the same way he'd stopped and looked at Patricia herself across the kitchen table every morning for 41 years. He came around the corner of the house at 6:15. The rose bush was gone. Not cut back, not trimmed, gone, pulled from the soil at the roots, left in a heap beside the fence. The soil around it was disturbed, clearly dug at, not accidentally damaged. 3 of the longer canes had been snapped deliberately. Beside the heap, sitting against the fence post as if someone had left it there on purpose, as if it were a message, was a small garden trowel, not Raymond's. Raymond stood there for a long moment. He looked at the roses, the roots, the broken canes. Then he turned and looked at the flagpole in his front yard. The commemorative flag Patricia had given him was still there, moving gently in the morning wind. He went back inside, poured a 3rd cup of coffee, sat at the table, opened his notebook. Wrote 6:17 a.m., south fence, Patricia's rose bush removed and destroyed, roots pulled, deliberate, tool left at scene, not mine, photographed. He did not go next door, he did not raise his voice, he did not call anyone that morning. But that same evening at approximately 11:45 p.m., while Raymond sat reading in his living room with one lamp on, he heard a sound from his front yard. A soft sound, a rustling. He turned off the lamp, sat still, waited. Then a flicker of orange light through the curtain. He was out the front door in 6 seconds. The flag was burning. Brandon was already backing across the property line, a lighter in his hand, wearing the expression of a man who had just done something he was very proud of, something that passed in his particular moral universe for a statement. Raymond stood on the grass, watched the flag burn, watched Brandon watch him watch it burn. "That's destruction of private property," Raymond said, quietly, factually. Brandon tilted his head back slightly. "Prove it, old man." And Raymond said almost to himself, "I will." Direct hit engagement hook. If you think Raymond is going to let this go, you've never met a man like Raymond Earl Kowalski. And if you've ever had a neighbor who mistook your silence for weakness, I want you to hit that comment button right now, because this next part is for every one of you who was patient when you didn't have to be. Here's what nobody knew at the time. Let's start with the cameras. 6 months before Brandon Ashworth moved into 226 Clover Hill Lane, Raymond had installed a home security system, not because he expected trouble, but because his daughter in Des Moines had insisted after a string of porch thefts in a nearby neighborhood. 4K cameras. 2 covering the front of the house from different angles, 1 covering the south side where Patricia's rose bush was, 1 covering the driveway, all of them motion activated, all of them timestamped. All of them uploading in real time to a cloud server Raymond paid $12 a month to maintain, because a man who spent 26 years in military intelligence does not keep evidence in only one place. The camera on the south side had recorded everything at 4:48 a.m. on September 24th. Brandon's face, the garden trowel, the pulling of the roots. 14 minutes of clear 4K footage under the motion-activated security light, which had apparently not been enough of a deterrent for a young man who believed the rules didn't apply to him. The front camera had captured the flag burning in full, Brandon's face, the lighter, the date and timestamp at the bottom of the frame. That was evidence item 1. Here's what else nobody knew. Brandon Kyle Ashworth III had purchased the property at 226 Clover Hill Lane in July of 2019 for $387,000, a transaction that Raymond had his friend at the county assessor's office quietly review, and what that review revealed was interesting. The property survey on file, the one Brandon's real estate attorney had apparently not looked at closely enough, showed that the original fence line between 224 and 226 Clover Hill Lane did not match the fence currently standing between them. Sometime in the early 1990s, a previous owner of 226 had moved the fence approximately 14 inches into what was legally Raymond's property. The rose bush Patricia had planted had always been on Raymond's land, which meant that when Brandon pulled it out, he had not only destroyed private property, he had committed criminal trespass on land he did not own. That was evidence item 2. Here's evidence item 3, and this one, folks, is the one that changes the entire story. Terrence Ackeffer had made some calls of his own. The seed funding for Ashworth Nexus Solutions, the $4.2 million that Brandon's dissolved digital lifestyle optimization platform had received, had come from 2 sources. One was a venture capital firm out of Chicago with a clean record. The other was a holding company registered in Delaware whose beneficial owners were, at that moment, the subject of an active FBI investigation into wire fraud and money laundering connected to a real estate development scheme in Cook County, Illinois. Brandon Ashworth had not known this when he took the money, or perhaps he had. That distinction was precisely what the FBI was currently trying to determine. His name had appeared in the financial records. His phone records had been subpoenaed. He had moved to Cedar Falls, Iowa. He told people to get away from the city. He was, in the parlance of federal law enforcement, a person of interest. And he had just burned the flag and destroyed the property of a decorated Army veteran with a 26-year career in military intelligence who had, over the past 8 weeks, created a meticulous, time-stamped, witnessed, photographically documented record of every single thing Brandon had done. Raymond called Dolores Whitaker the morning after the flag burning. He said, "I'm ready. Now let me pause here for just a moment because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave inch by inch and just waited because you knew that patience was your greatest weapon? Drop a comment. Tell me you've been there. Because what's coming next, what Raymond built, what he handed to the people who needed it, it's something you do not want to miss." It was a Friday morning, October 18th, 2019. The kind of Iowa morning that reminds you the summer has left for good and taken its warmth with it. 43 degrees. A thin frost on the grass that crunched under your shoes. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the bare branches of the maples along Clover Hill Lane ticked against each other in a light northwest wind. Raymond was up at 5. He made coffee, the good stuff, the Colombian blend Patricia had always preferred. He showered, dressed, put on his army sweatshirt, and sat at his kitchen table with his notebook in front of him, open to the last page of entries. 52 days of documentation. 52 days of dates, times, photographs, written statements from 4 neighbors, including Carl Brinkman, Linda Hernandez, and Officer Diaz, who had submitted a formal statement of his own accord, and 3 recorded incidents with clear video evidence that would hold up in any courtroom in the state of Iowa. At 7:15, he heard the first car. Not a police cruiser. A black Ford Expedition with federal plates which parked with deliberate calm in front of 226 Clover Hill Lane, then a second one, then a Lynn County Sheriff's vehicle, then an unmarked sedan that Raymond recognized immediately as the kind driven by people who prefer not to be recognized. He poured a fresh cup of coffee and walked to his front porch. He sat in his rocker, the old one with the cracked armrest that he kept meaning to fix, and he watched. At 7:22, the front door of 226 opened. Brandon Ashworth stepped out in a gray cashmere bathrobe and a pair of slide sandals, holding a ceramic mug with the logo of a Chicago rooftop bar on it. His hair was uncombed. He was squinting at the morning the way a man squints when he hasn't been awake long enough to understand what's happening. He saw the cars. He saw the men. He saw the badges. The senior agent, a tall woman named Special Agent Dana Howell, whom Terrence Acaffer had spoken with twice in the prior 2 weeks, walked up the front path and introduced herself. She held up her credentials. She explained that she had a federal search warrant for the property and devices at 226 Clover Hill Lane in connection with a financial fraud investigation, and that she also had in her hand a civil complaint filed by Mr. Raymond Kowalski through the firm of Whitaker, Soren and Associates of Cedar Rapids, citing criminal trespass, destruction of private property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and harassment, accompanied by a motion for an emergency restraining order that had been granted by the Lynn County District Court at 9 p.m. the prior evening. Brandon's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Behind the agents, a county surveyor's truck had pulled up. 2 men in orange vests got out and began measuring the fence line between 224 and 226. Because as part of the civil complaint, Raymond had submitted the property survey discrepancy, the 14-inch encroachment, which meant that the fence between the 2 properties was legally built on land that belonged to Raymond. The surveyor was there to confirm the line. The fence removal order would follow. Brandon's ceramic mug hit the porch. It didn't shatter. It just bounced and rolled, and the coffee spread across the front steps in a dark stain that nobody rushed to clean up. There were, at this point, 7 neighbors standing in their yards or on their porches watching. Carl Brinkman was there with Biscuit. Linda Hernandez had come out in her coat. The Nakamura twins watched from their upstairs window. Raymond didn't watch any of this. He sat in his rocker. He drank his coffee. He looked out at the frost on his front lawn, at the place where Patricia's roses would bloom again in the spring, because he had, the week prior, quietly ordered a replacement plant from a Heritage Rose nursery in Oregon, the same variety Patricia had chosen all those years ago. He didn't need to watch Brandon Ashworth understand what had happened to him. He already knew. The civil lawsuit Dolores Whitaker filed sought $847,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, $200,000 for the destruction of property including the commemorative flag, the rose bush, the damaged mailbox, and documented harassment-related expenses, $400,000 for emotional distress and intentional infliction of emotional harm, and $247,000 in legal fees and punitive damages. The motion for restraining order prohibited Brandon from coming within 50 feet of Raymond's property for the duration of the proceedings. The fence came down by court order 11 days later. 3 men with tools took it apart on a bright November morning and moved it to the correct position, 14 inches into what had been Brandon's yard. The new post holes were filled and tamped and the fence went up properly, and nobody said a word about it. The FBI investigation was a separate matter entirely. Raymond had simply handed Terrence Okafor the documentation he'd collected, dates, behaviors, the money trail he'd noticed when he'd looked at Brandon's public business filings, and let the professionals handle what was beyond the scope of a civil complaint. Whatever Brandon had or hadn't done with the Chicago investors, that was for federal prosecutors to determine. Raymond's job had been to document what he'd seen, and he had done his job exceptionally well. The street got very quiet after that. Not an uncomfortable quiet, a different kind, the kind that settles over a place when something unresolved has finally been resolved, like a house after a long illness. The stillness isn't grief, it's exhale. Brandon Ashworth did not come outside for several days after the search. When he did, it was briefly, purposefully walking to his car, looking at his phone, not making eye contact with anyone. The people of Clover Hill Lane did not go out of their way to engage him. There were no confrontations, no words, just the ordinary life of a neighborhood going about its business, which is its own kind of statement. His parents drove down from Chicago 2 weeks after the search. A silver BMW 7 Series, Illinois plates. They were inside for several hours. When they left, Brandon's mother did not look like a woman who had come to celebrate anything. The Escalade sat in the driveway for most of November. Then one morning in early December, a moving truck appeared at 226 Clover Hill Lane. Not 2 trucks this time, just one. It wasn't a large one. The movers worked quietly, loading what they loaded, and at around 2 in the afternoon, Brandon Ashworth came out the front door with a duffel bag over his shoulder and a phone to his ear, and got into the Escalade and backed out of the driveway and drove down Clover Hill Lane and turned right at Maple Drive, and that was the last time anyone on that street saw him in person. Not one person came outside. Not one person waved. The house at 226 sat empty through the winter, which in Cedar Falls, Iowa, is its own kind of quiet. You want to know what happened to Brandon Kyle Ashworth? The civil suit was settled out of court in April of 2020, 14 months after the whole thing began, for a figure that Raymond's attorney confirmed was substantially close to the original demand. Dolores Whitaker, who had been waiting 19 years for a case this clean, did not accept anything less than full justice, and the Ashworth family attorneys knew it. Brandon's involvement in the federal investigation was resolved in 2021. He was not charged with criminal conspiracy. Prosecutors determined he had been a passive rather than active participant in the fraud scheme, but he was required to cooperate fully with the investigation, forfeit the remaining seed funds, and pay a civil penalty assessed by the SEC. He was by all accounts effectively broke by the time the process concluded. The lifestyle was gone. The Escalade was gone. The Chicago social circle had long since moved on. Last anyone heard, he was working in his father's property management company in a junior capacity. His LinkedIn page no longer lists him as a founder or executive of anything. The house at 226 Clover Hill Lane sold in March of 2020. A young couple named florist Daniel and Sarah, who had 2 small kids and a chocolate Labrador named Muffin, which is not a particularly dignified name for a dog, but who are any of us to judge. Daniel was a respiratory therapist at the local hospital. Sarah taught 3rd grade. They were within approximately 6 weeks exactly the kind of neighbors that 226 had always deserved. Sarah Flores brought Raymond a plate of tamales the first week they moved in. He taught their son Mateo how to build a birdhouse the following summer. Mateo's is crooked and beautiful and hangs in the Flores' backyard to this day. Patricia's replacement rose bush came up in June of 2020. Deep red, exactly the same variety. Raymond stood in the garden and looked at it for a long time that first morning. Then he went inside and made coffee and came back out and sat in his lawn chair beside it in the early morning light and just sat, the way you sit with something you thought you'd lost. And every Memorial Day at exactly 6 in the morning, Raymond Earl Kowalski walks out his front door in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and raises his flag. A new one now, full color, all 50 stars, nylon reinforced grommets that are specifically rated to be fire resistant. He bought it the week after the old one burned. Because a man like Raymond Kowalski doesn't stop raising his flag. He just makes the next one harder to burn. You know, I've told a lot of stories on this channel. Stories about people who pushed and people who pushed back, about patience and provocation, about what it means to be a neighbor, which is maybe one of the most underrated forms of relationship there is, because it's one you didn't choose and can't easily leave and have to figure out how to live with regardless of how it goes. And every time I tell one of these stories, somebody asks me the same question. They say, why didn't he just fight back sooner? Why did he wait so long? Why not just confront the guy from day one? And my answer is always the same. Because Raymond Kowalski understood something that most of us have to learn the hard way. The man who loses his temper hands his power to someone else. The man who documents quietly and waits patiently never loses his. There's a kind of strength that looks like stillness. There's a kind of patience that looks like surrender right up until the moment it doesn't. Raymond didn't wait because he was afraid. He didn't wait because he was uncertain. He waited because he knew the way a man who has sat in a hide for days waiting for intelligence to develop knows that the moment would come, that the evidence would be complete, that the case would be airtight. And when it was, he didn't scream, he didn't threaten. He handed a folder to a lawyer, made a phone call to an old friend, and went home to drink his coffee. Brandon Ashworth came to Clover Hill Lane thinking he had moved next to an old man with a flag. What he had actually moved next to was 26 years of patience, discipline, documentation, and a notebook full of every single thing he had ever done. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak man. Never mistake patience for permission. And never, not ever, pick a fight with a veteran who spent 2 decades teaching other people how to win before they ever walked into a room. The flag is still flying at 224 Clover Hill Lane. And it will be there tomorrow morning when Raymond gets up at 5, makes his coffee, and steps out onto his porch to watch the sun come up over Cedar Falls. Just like always. This story is inspired by real events and public court records. Names, locations, and specific details have been changed or dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental.